Jared Vieyra has had a deep impact on the lives around him. In what would be considered a small town in Southern California, he has had tremendous reach. More than 50% of those who attend the church he pastors consistently volunteer in the church or in the community. Over the years, he has helped raise an extraordinarily high percentage of leaders in both ministry and in business. He has the ability to see potential and is always inviting people to take the challenge of growing and being shaped into who God has designed them to be.
You're a leader, called to inspire others to be the same. You're called to experience the fullness of God's promises. You boldly face your fears. You chart your own path when you need to. When life knocks you down, you get back up one more time, every time. You're forever learning, increasing your capacity to be the best you. You're strong, resilient. You're not easily discouraged, and you're never defeated. You're rugged on the inside, but on the outside, you're identified as loving, gracious, consistent. You don't quit. This is your life, your portion. You're a leader, forged in the fire.
Well, hey everybody, welcome to the Blacksmith Order. I am Jared, the founder and the host of the Blacksmith Order, which really is just ultimately like a video blog that is devoted to helping leaders in any sort of circle really become the leader that they're capable of being. This is all about increasing your capacity to lead and influence people. It's about effectiveness, and so whether you are a leader in your household, leader in your community, in your church, you're a business owner, whatever it is, our desire is ultimately to help encourage you, give you some tools, tell some stories, share some of our mistakes or whatnot, and help hopefully encourage you in a path forward. We're all about learning, loving, and leading people. And so I want to talk to you tonight briefly about excuses. And it's it's Christmas night. Everybody's probably wrapping up all of the festivities and finishing with all the partings and doing all the damage control now. Hopefully balancing checkbooks, and hopefully you survived. I know it was crazy around here. We have multiple parties, and like Christmas Eve and Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, and it's just been wild and crazy. Our house is destroyed, and there is candy and wrappers and crumbs and toys everywhere. But this time of year is when obviously everybody's setting goals, right? Everybody's talking about the new year and coming up with resolutions, and hopefully we can be resolute in those, that we can follow through, that we can stick to it. And one of the biggest things that I've seen in people's lives be, and in my own life really, been a barrier for achievement, been a barrier for next level, whatever that is, whether that's like spiritual growth, whether it's business, family, and just whatever goals, whatever things you're striving for. One of the biggest barriers that we face, that we put in front of ourselves, is a little thing called excuses. Like, we use excuses all the time, everywhere, everything. I mean, like, we grow up doing this, and I even notice it in our kids sometimes. And we're just inundated with it, right? Like, I mean, we get emails from our kids' school. Is this absent, excused or unexcused? What's going on? And we have sick days, and we call in sick, and we but some of those things are legitimate, and sometimes there are legitimate reasons why we don't achieve certain things. But I think we need to run our excuses through a bit of a filter. We need to, I think, take an honest look at the reasons why, especially in the areas of like the things we're not accomplishing, the things we're not growing, and the things we're not seeing really bring to change, really. And I think ultimately at the core of excuses is really avoidance. Like, we want to avoid consequences. I remember as a teenager, I was a police explorer with the Orange Police Department, and I remember, we would have to meet in formation every week in our uniforms. Everything had to be polished, pressed. There was no wrinkles. Our shirts had to be a certain way. All of our insignias and name tags and badges, all of our gear had a place, and there was an appropriate way to wear things, and everything had to be polished and neat and clean and no dust and lint or anything like that. Our hair had to be combed, and we had to be, freshly shaven for those of us that could at that time. And but I just remember people around me, for whatever reason, would get kind of attention drawn to them because maybe their uniform wasn't up to standards or whatever. They didn't follow through with a certain task or something. And there was always somebody that just had some long drawn out excuse as to why their stuff was in poor shape or not operational, or they didn't have it at all. It's like, what are you doing? Like, why are you in your uniform and you have like white socks, or your shoes aren't polished, or you don't have, or you got some like ridiculous accessory on your uniform that isn't, the kind of the standard issue and stuff. And I remember people would just go on and on and on about these excuses, and our TAC officer would kind of rally around them and pick apart their excuses and make fun of them because of their excuses. And ultimately, I learned through other people's mistakes when for some reason I missed the mark on something. And the TAC officers would be in your face and, what's going on? Vieyra, why is this happening? And my response was always from attention, no excuse, sir. Like, I have no excuse. I'm not going to waste your time. I'm not going to lie to you. No excuse, sir. And I always found that there was a little bit more leniency in that. Like, sure, there were consequences. It usually ended up with doing push-ups or doing some sort of written memo or some sort of little physical challenge or something. But there's always consequences. But the flack and the reputation that you learned from or earned from just saying, sir, no excuse. There's no excuse, sir. And it was, you take your licks, you take your punishment, you get your consequences, and the attention moves elsewhere. But the people that always came up with excuses always drew the attention and always drew negative attention. And I think we just have to realize that, there's going to be consequences to our action or inaction. But one of the things that causes more and more negative attention in our lives, whatever that might look like, is our tendency to come up with excuses. And it has an impact. I think that's the number one thing that we have to realize and admit when it comes to our excuses. When it comes to poor performance, when it comes to not being prepared, when it comes to, whatever it is, when we come up with the inconsistencies and things like that, ineffectiveness, when we come up with excuses time and time and time again, it has an impact on people. The people around you, the team that you serve with, the team that you're a part of, the team that, you work with on a regular basis. It has an impact on family when you constantly live in this place of excuses. And it really becomes deceptive. Right? Because at the root of it, it's really lies. If you think about it, if you're honest with it, like, you come up with this kind of exaggerated version of why you're not cutting it. And it's a hard pattern to break. I've watched young people for a lot of years in a variety of different roles, and they've learned from an early age to lie and to give excuses, and it really is manipulative and stuff. And even in our culture today, there's this sense of like, I don't want to be responsible for anything, right? Like you watch stuff that's happening on the news, whether it's some of the political tension and things that are happening in our culture, and especially in this younger generation, there is like this idea that, like, I don't want to be responsible for things. Like, there's this expectation maybe for government to take care of me, to do these things for me that I don't or shouldn't have to behave in certain ways or provide a certain thing or contribute something or work for anything that I just, I don't need to be responsible. And really, that when we focus on excuses and we bring excuses to the table time and time again, and really that's what we're saying is, I don't want to be responsible. I don't want to be responsible for anything. I've even seen people like blame God. They they're facing certain situations in their lives and going through certain trouble and facing really what they are is consequences, right? That there's choice A, and they make choice A, and choice A comes with a bunch of consequences, right? You ever heard the phrase, play stupid games, you win stupid prizes? And that's kind of what it is. And there's a lot of people in their immaturity. They look at the circumstances, they look at the trouble they're in, they look at their financial situations, they look at their relationship issues, they look at their poor performance on the job, and it's always blaming. And at the root of it is this desire to not be responsible for something. Like, it's ridiculous. I've seen people heard people blame God for the trouble in their life. They blame God, like, oh, we got pregnant, and they're mad at God. Why did God let this happen? Well, let me tell you how this whole thing works, right? Do you understand how pregnancy comes about? God didn't do it, right? I heard a story recently also. A guy in, I think it was 2005, I think he was Romanian. He actually filed a lawsuit against God in a civil court. And it was ridiculous. The guy made a claim that he tithed, probably one time, but he tithed and he tried this. And it is a biblical principle to give 1/10 of your income to the local church. And it's a principle where it says, God says, test me in it. So he's like, okay, I did it and I prayed and God didn't do anything. And I didn't actually see what specifically he was asking God to do or expecting God to do, like as if God's some sort of genie, that he's supposed to respond and, it's like a slot machine or something. I don't know. But he's like, I prayed and I tithed and God didn't come through. And he blamed God for this and he was angry with God and he felt like God was responsible. He wasn't responsible. So he filed a claim in this Romanian civil court. And the court actually, I guess, decided with God. They're like, God isn't subject to civil court, so case dismissed. And it's just ridiculous. Like, where does this, this desire to escape responsibility come from? And I think we find it in in the scriptures. Is I think one really great illustration of it, and really one great story of it in Genesis. Like the original sin, the fall, wasn't just some great immoral thing, right? It was a poor choice. It was a misguided, misinformed choice, and it was a free will choice. God didn't make them do it, and immediately, they go to the blame game. Nobody wanted to take responsibility, right? And I think that's where this mindset is just kind of ingrained in our nature, and we see immediately it impacts lives and relationships. Eve sinned and Adam sinned and God steps in. He's like, hey, what's going on? What happened? What are you doing? And immediately, he blames the woman. Instead of stepping up and saying, listen, I'm sorry, it's my fault. I wasn't being responsible. I didn't step in. I wasn't paying attention. I just was ignoring the wanderings of my family, and I wasn't aware of the situations. Like, nowhere in this story does he go, it's not my fault, but you know what? I'm going to take responsibility for it. I should have done something. I should have stepped in. I should have made things go down a little differently. I should have seen this coming. Whatever. There is no sense of responsibility in there. There's an excuse. And then we even see Eve. She immediately blames the serpent, and so everybody's pointing the finger at everybody else and blaming everybody else. And it's I think it's in our nature sometimes. It's an area of weakness, and we begin to justify. We begin to focus on other people's actions or inaction, and we blame them for our choices. It's an excuse. It's a reason. It's a justification, and. I think God ultimately in that story, I think we see in how the story's laid out and the description of the environment that God created and the responsibility that, we are to assume responsibility for our lives and the things God has given us stewardship over. And when we just continue to live in excuses, that we'll never really reach the influence, live in a place fruitfulness and effectiveness if we're constantly pointing the finger. The other thing is like a lot of people, if you let this take root over time, what happens is we get so preoccupied with other people. And I think the essence of being responsible is focusing on you. Like, we can get so preoccupied with what other people are doing, what other people, how they're spending their time, how they're living their lives, and we can either desire that, or we can use it as an excuse to do whatever we want, or we just hear all sorts of ridiculous examples, like, well, at least I'm not as bad as so and so. Well, nowhere in that did you take responsibility for your action. You just compared, like, and so, even in Matthew 7, where he talks about, like, hey, you're hypocritical, like you're pointing out this this speck in your brother's eye, but you're not paying attention to this log in your own. Like, you were so preoccupied with everyone else and what other people are doing or not doing that you're not paying attention to you. And when we live in this life of this pattern of excuses and ineffectiveness and really immaturity and lack of growth and pursuit and correction, self-correction, changing direction and different things, it's because we're so preoccupied with everyone else. And even just this pattern also of exaggeration, right? Back to that Genesis story in the Bible, like, Eve exaggerated the details of who said what and what were the consequences, and everything was kind of drug out a little bit more, and that opened up the door. An exaggeration of details opened up the door ultimately for deception, for a lie, and for excuses. And I think when we over exaggerate things, I once had an employee that was like, oh, I was called in sick and I was, this was happening, and it was a lie. And then a couple of sentences later, it was another type of illness. And I'm like, wait a minute, like, what was really happening? And ultimately, it was a lie. It was an excuse. It wasn't a valid one. And it was really an exaggeration and had some negative consequences. But this thing is, like, it's ingrained in our nature, and we have to be purposeful. We have to run our reasoning through a filter of responsibility. We have to get to a place where you're like, man, it was my fault. Like, as a leader, I certainly don't love it when people make mistakes. I don't love it when things go undone. But you know what? I do understand that we're flawed, that we make mistakes, that we are distracted sometimes, sometimes we get busy. And, one of the things I have extra grace for is when people mess up, but fess up. Like, when we're sitting at the table and we're discussing things, and when we're coming up with plans and a strategy, and then we connect a week or two later and we're like, hey, did this happen? What's going on with this project? And it's just like, it didn't get done. But if that's followed with, I'm sorry, I forgot, or, whatever, it got held up somewhere, I'm sorry, I take responsibility for that. Was my bad, my fault. I'll get on it. I'll fix it. That's it. That's all we need to do. There's no anger. There's no, like, is it frustrating? Did it set us back? Maybe, but we can bounce back from it. But when it's answered with an excuse and blame and, oh, I did this and I called them and I got that, then it's just this, like, you're just wasting breath. You're wasting everybody's time. And ultimately what it's saying is it wasn't a priority. Like, I would rather hear that from somebody that, that works for me or whatever, that, like, no, it didn't happen. I'm sorry. It wasn't a priority this week because, whatever. Like, I would rather hear the honest truth, like, sorry, I dropped the ball. Now, if it continues to happen, then that's another discussion. But, like, I would rather hear, I missed the mark. I'm sorry, and let's move on. Sometimes I hear people, like, when there is a mistake and there is an excuse for it, and there's, sometimes it's followed with a discussion, and we're trying to figure out why things didn't happen or why things happened a certain way. And have you ever heard somebody say, well, I'm sorry if, right? Like, I'm sorry if you feel that I didn't do this, or I didn't perform well, or I'm sorry if you feel that way. Like ultimately, like the apology, the responsibility is kind of dismissed with that if. It's a little word, only 2 letters, but there's a lot wrapped up in that if. And when you put that, well, I'm sorry if, really what you're saying is, I disagree with your perception. I disagree with your that you feel that I'm responsible for that. But I'll try to smooth things over a little bit by this, kind of canned response that's insincere. I'd rather just hear the truth than an excuse. Why not just say I didn't have time? Like, if it's true, in fact, like, you didn't have time. Well, like, we all have the same amount of time in a day. What are you doing with it? How are you managing your time? Are you saying yes to too many things? I mean, there's so many things I think to kind of run a filter through. Like, are we kind of addicted to saying yes to things and promising things and committing to things and trying to earn value and position and influence by playing the part and wanting to do things? Or, are we really doing stuff? Are we really following through with what's expected of us and what we're given responsibility for? Because the excuse about I didn't have time is either a valid point, and maybe you need to work on time management, or maybe you need to, learn this powerful discipline of saying no to certain things, because it boils down to integrity, self-control. I love it when people walk in late to a meeting, right? Sorry, you get the message. Sorry, traffic's bad, and they come in with Starbucks, right? Like, was traffic bad or was the line long? Like, it's just getting there on time wasn't a priority, and I think that becomes the truth. And when we get to that, when it's just like it wasn't a priority for me, why not? And move forward. But living in a place and practicing consistent excuses will get you nowhere. Look, it's almost 2019, right? And people have financial goals, people have business goals, and want to grow their bank accounts. They want to grow influence. You want to grow profits. You want to grow customers. You want to grow your contact list. You want to grow whatever it is. Are you going to be responsible? Are you going to manage your time? Are you going to be integrous? Or will you be an ineffective leader that is just full of excuses, full of blame, and preoccupied with other people? Or will you be occupied and focused on what it is God's called you to do and what He's given you responsibility for? I'm Jared Vieyra. This is the Blacksmith Order. We'll see you next time.